this got on my screen here. It's getting marked up here. I don't know what that's about. Huh, okay, well, we'll get started here. So, I don't know why this is annotating. Here, let's maybe turn off, clear the annotation, clear all drawings. There we go. Okay. So my name is Sam Redmond, and I'm a historian. I teach at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and this is a talk about a project that I'm currently working on peace medals in North America. And there are many, many different ways that we could start this story, many different places that we could start the story, but we'll start the story here. Main Street in Red Wing, Minnesota in about 1869, perhaps a few years after the end of the Civil War. And according to newspaper reports, they are expanding Main Street in Red Wing, Minnesota, and they discover a grave. And in this grave that they think is of a Native American man, they discover something that confounds the people in the town. They find a medal that depicts Thomas Jefferson. So on the medal, they can clearly see an image of Thomas Jefferson and the words Thomas Jefferson, President of the USA, US and AD 1801. So the medal has a date. So there's sort of this confounding moment for people in the town in Red Wing. It's near what had become a Native American reservation. Many Native Americans who had lived in this area had been displaced quite violently to Nebraska by this time. But people were sort of curious about what this could be, a Native American grave that had a medal that depicted a president on it. It seems sort of a confounding moment in the town. It turns out that this was a Native American peace medal, or an Indian peace medal as it's sometimes called. And I'll get a little bit more into what they are and what sort of stories they represent. But the main thing that I'd like to get across to you this evening is that these are fascinating and confounding, complicated objects. They are stubbornly colonial and Native American. They are common and uncommon. They are just sort of the slew of contradictions. And in some ways, this presentation then will offer no easy answers on what we're looking at, the sort of subjects that we're dealing with. We'll talk about what an authentic medal is and what a not authentic medal is, and does it even matter? We'll ask whether or not these things should be in museums, and some of the same questions that people are asking about monuments today. What sort of things we should memorialize and why are, relevant questions to thinking about peace medals. So this is a book that I'm writing now, and I'm thinking about it from a number of different perspectives. But perhaps that place to start is a little bit with the mystery that already by the Civil War, they are known and unknown. People kind of could understand what they were, but didn't know what they were. So if you came into this presentation tonight not knowing what peace medals are, you are not at all alone. So this painting that we're looking at is a famous portrait of several Omaha leaders from about where the middle of the United States now, the Nebraska area, who had come to Washington, D.C. and are shown here. At least one, perhaps two of the leaders are shown here wearing peace medals. But you can see these are not things that are happening all alone, right? If I were to just show you pictures tonight of individual peace medals, one right after another, you'd be missing out on the full story. You'd be perhaps not understanding that these are things that were incorporated in many important and meaningful respects into Native American culture and society. These were medals that were gifted to Native American leaders. And I'll argue to you tonight that peace medals were uniquely durable symbols of power and status that reached across many different cultures in North America. So what you may know, if you know something about Native American cultures, but many of us don't know, and something that I didn't really know and understand until I was a little older in my education, is that there are more than 500 different Native American nations and First Nations nations in Canada in North America. So there are many, many different cultures and societies. And of course, not all of these cultures value the same things. Not all of them have the same interests and religious traditions and material culture. There's a huge amount of diversity within just North America. So it's remarkable that these colonial gestures, this colonial gift that we're going to talk about tonight, was so remarkably successful across dozens and dozens of different Native American tribes. That alone, I think, is an interesting sort of fact to take home with us this evening. But they're much more complex, the story, it turns out, than that. So we'll sort of start at the beginning here. Here's a collection of images of Spanish, French, and British peace medals. So you may know that not long after Columbus's purported discovery of North America, which, as we probably all know, is a really problematic and probably very false way to think about that moment, but it did really open up the floodgates after 1492 of colonial ventures into North America. And what would that look like? Well, the Spanish and the French were looking for resources, mines, ways to trade with Native Americans, access to the fur trade. And one thing that they decided to do is take medals, which were already a tradition in Europe by this time. So there was a tradition of giving a warrior or a member of a noble class a medal, maybe depicting a royal figure on it, like you'll see in these medals here. I'm not exactly sure this is how I would want my nose depicted if I were being put onto a medal, but you know, some of these are purportedly created by very skilled and talented craftsmen. And indeed, they were molded into silver. Some of them you can see an older or younger version of a king. If the king were on his throne for a long time, they might make several different medals over time. But it turned out that these were really accepted quite readily as gifts, and they were quite successful in North America when offered as gifts from the Spanish or French or British crown. So interestingly, to me, it's just an interesting way to frame this sort of discussion. The Spanish, the French, and the British, as you may know, were in some ways after different things with their colonization. Some of them were really aggressively going after land. Others were really aggressively going after mineral resources. But kind of no matter what their end was, they adopted this practice of offering and giving peace medals to Native Americans. But why did they accept these medals is, I think, an important and valuable question for us to consider, and one that some other historians have considered a little, but not as much as they maybe should. Well, one important aspect to this is that many Native Americans already had traditions that involved wearing something quite similar to what becomes a peace medal, these sort of European introduction of a peace medal. So here you can see, now I'm going to show many sort of famous images of Native Americans throughout these sort of next few slides. And some of them I'll get into a little bit more detail of who they are. Others I won't. And I want to be clear that with basically all of these, you could get into more detail about who of each of these individuals are. Sometimes not as much as you would like, unfortunately. But I want to give you a sense that these are not exactly ubiquitous, but there are hundreds and hundreds of images of Native Americans from the 19th century wearing these medals. So this isn't exactly a rarity that I'm talking to you today, but it is also the case that there are hundreds and hundreds of images of people not wearing these, and they might be leaders in their tribe and might never be gifted a peace medal. So again, you may have seen these, you may not have seen these. It's sort of an everywhere and nowhere at the same time. But turning back to that big question of why and how these became so readily adopted in many societies, these shell objects that European chroniclers describe using a term called gorget or gorget, depending on your preferred pronunciation, which is Old French literally for throat. So this is both a tradition, as we'll see in some European cultures, but also wearing a shell adornment, a round shell adornment, as a sign of status and symbol and power within one's own tribe was an existing sort of feature of many Native American societies. So again, these were brought on or utilized by many different European colonizers and invaders. And some of the imagery here really evokes that sort of colonial venture and sort of the goal here. And maybe it's at this moment when I'm showing you some of these museum pictures of peace medals that it might be a good opportunity to just briefly pause and mention that I'm really fortunate in this presentation and in this project in general to have support from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, which is the Natural History Museum and the Science Museum in Denver. And through a weird twist of history and fate, they have the third largest collection of peace medals in North America, trailing only the Smithsonian and the American Numismatic Society that collects things like medals and coins. But through this sort of remarkable twist of history, the Denver Museum of Nature and Science has this collection that is almost exhaustive of peace medals. And what's so remarkable about these is that many of them have been used. And it gets us into sort of this conversation that coin enthusiasts or numismatists, coin experts, sometimes coin collectors, are after the pristine, the perfect, the unused, the sort of almost like miraculously new looking thing. Whereas I, as a historian and collectors of other kinds, many Native Americans as well, value different sorts of things about these objects. And so for me, I find it really interesting when we see an object that's been given as a gift and actually been used and valued by a member of another culture, and thinking about how or why they valued that object, how they cared for that object, and what it meant to them. So I think this is an important project in that it helps us really think about the questions like, what is authentic? What does that really mean? And what is it? Why do we value different things about different objects? So again, let me just briefly tie back to why these were successful as objects. Why did they become so readily incorporated by colonial powers and accepted by the British? In part because we can see they fit within the sort of heraldry of the 18th century, just generally. And that included George Washington, pictured here while still an officer in the British military, but of course pictured wearing prominently a gorget, right? So it's then not hard to imagine that when George Washington becomes president himself, he adopts this tradition that had been previously held by European powers, right? This idea that we should gift and offer peace medals. Now, in the new United States, we had the problem of we didn't have any of the minting technology we needed to make medals, right? So really the only way to do this was either to have hand engravers, silversmiths, make these sort of early, almost crude renditionings of medals and offer them as gift. You can see two examples The first one is with the darkened background is actually an earlier image, and it features, we think, a female figure here, perhaps a Greek or Roman goddess representing liberty. But there's a lot of really loaded symbols here, a lot of, as we'll see, in many respects, increasingly racialist and indeed racist in their connotations. But there are also many, many other symbols that are loaded here, right? Like a palm tree sort of encircling or becoming enmeshed with sort of an oak tree, again and again, so maybe representing sort of north and south in the colonies. Again and again, we'll see farming and agriculture represented as sort of an ideal. We'll see again and again the symbol of the pipe or the peace offering. Again and again, we'll see the axe thrown away as sort of a secession of violence. These are symbols that become embedded into peace medals over time. Okay, so it's important to understand and recognize that basically right away, these become really important and meaningful gifts for Native Americans. You can see now, this is purportedly the story of one single medal that we'll trace here. This is apparently a gift from George Washington himself. He's in the room giving it to a famed orator, a Seneca orator named Red Jacket, who then becomes a famous public speaker who's advocating on behalf of Native American rights. And his nephew, his tribal nephew, I don't think they're direct blood related, but a close connection within the Seneca tribe, Eli Parker, is given the medal or gets the medal a couple of generations later, 2 generations later. Parker is intensely fascinating as a figure because he is General Ulysses S. Grant's right-hand man during the Civil War at a time when most Native Americans are barred from entry into the war. And he has such spectacular handwriting that he happens to be the guy who writes the surrender documents of the end of the Civil War. And as though that's not enough for sort of being in the room when history happens, he becomes the first Native American head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So he continues personally this tradition of giving peace medals later on. But as you can see, he personally cares for it a great deal. And that exact medal apparently ends up in the Buffalo Historical Society. So turning now to probably the most famous example of peace medals, this example that we talked about from the opening, from the outset, these incredible Jefferson medals that were offered as gifts, most famously during the Lewis and Clark expedition. So you can see now that these are more vividly connected to those earlier peace medals. There's been debate within art historians who have looked at this and political historians who have looked at this, like, why do we suddenly have almost like a monarch-like image on this American medal? Perhaps Jefferson was sort of confident enough in his position as president to sort of have this callback. We do have written documents where Jefferson said that he knew what peace medals were. And he even got ticked off that the Spanish were giving peace medals on the fringes of what had become American territory. So he was quite well aware that this was going on. And they ordered dozens of peace medals initially, and they kept using this exact design through several sort of iterations for both Jefferson's presidency and the next presidency to follow. But, you know, I mean, this would have been, it's an interesting sort of scene to imagine, and a scene that Lewis and Clark write about quite vividly in their diaries, that they would meet people who maybe had not encountered any American delegation or any European delegation in the past. And what's remarkable is that there's quite little violence. There are some episodes of violence, but that actually Lewis and Clark encounter people who are quite willing to help translate, quite willing to provide directions, instructions, some assistance. And you know, why is the case? Like, why is that the case? We can sort of think about and ponder why that might be. And in some part, it's because these relations were smoothed over by the recognition of leadership, and that it gave Native people some agency to be able to put forward who their leaders were. Now, it's actually kind of surprising that given how successful Lewis and Clark basically used all of the rest of the Washington medals, everything that was left over, and a whole new batch of Lewis and Clark, Jefferson medals. I think they maybe came back with one medal. I think it's the case that they left with 89 medals and they gave away 88 of them, or something like that. So it's kind of surprising then that Zebulon Pike, one of the next major American explorers, doesn't bring any medals at all. And I bet he's kicking himself basically in the entire way through this journey to try to go find the headwaters of the Mississippi River, all the way up to in Minnesota, all the way down through Texas and Mexico, and into the American Southwest, because he writes again and again and again about seeing peace medals and being sort of saddened that he doesn't have American medals to trade and give away as a symbol or sign of an altered allegiance. It's unclear the degree to which Native people felt like this was an altered allegiance, but certainly the people giving these medals felt like that was the case. Now, as historians have speculated, that medal that I talked about in the beginning of the talk was promised to the Native American individual in Red Wing at the time of Pike's expedition, but we don't quite know for sure. So these medals are remarkable for many different reasons, but one of the many reasons is that people potentially wore them for a long time. They potentially wore them at ceremonies, and there are descriptions of people ceremonially cleansing the medals with smoke before wearing them, having them at special occasions. And then if a hook or sort of the top of a medal fell off, re-piercing or utilizing the medal again. So I just want to show a couple of examples. This is a medal called a treaty medal that you can see was a medal given to a First Nations tribe in Canada. That is, this one's from 1873, but I wanted to suggest to you, again, this sort of a plaid loop here as sort of an addition, but these additions or changes would happen occasionally. And again, on the Canadian medal, the sort of symbols of agriculture and sort of the cessation of violence is being prominent here. Again, what is a beautiful example of this? What is an important example of this? The medals that I'm showing you today, none of them, as far as the historical records that I was able to locate show, were taken from grave sites. I want to be clear about that. But this medal, for example, was discovered in a farm field to be incredibly beat up. And to me, this is really fascinating, and it shows something important. It shows potentially how this was valued and cared for. And to me, it's as a historian and potentially to an anthropologist and maybe a Native American person today looking at it, they might see something quite different than, say, a beat up or a not pristine object. I think this is actually quite fascinating to look at and to ponder what the life of this object could have been, and then to sort of see what the limits of our historical knowledge about an object might be. So this is a James Monroe medal, and now you can see that reverse side, the exact reverse die of peace and friendship was used for many years subsequently to the famed Jefferson medal. That changes when you get up to presidencies like Millard Fillmore. One fun thing about peace medals is that you get to talk about totally forgotten presidencies like Millard Fillmore. Who's even heard of Millard Fillmore? I probably shouldn't say that as a historian, but for real, he's a pretty obscure president in terms of our overall sort of historical arc. But you can see here on the reverse of the medal, there's sort of, again, the front of these medals sort of take on that monarch sort of almost Romanesque sort of vivid imagery, but now the reverse of the medal has changed, again, sort of emphasizing the agriculture and the cessation of violence here. Okay, so perhaps Abraham Lincoln is better known than Millard Fillmore. I bet most of us in this room would probably agree. And his medal, of course, carries on in many of the same traditions, the sort of monarchical, almost Romanesque or classic antiquity sort of feel to the front of the medal. But now we have some vivid imagery and pretty violent imagery that's appearing here on the back of the medal that you know, potentially shows here, or I think clearly shows, one Native American scalping another, which art historians have speculated is sort of a suggestion here on the medal of the choice between violence and peace. I don't know. I think this is quite a complex set of images. Now, if you look quite closely here at the back of the medal, this is a pretty pristine example, but what art historians have read here, which to me is unbelievably remarkable, is one of the very first renditions of the game of baseball. So, I mean, an agricultural scene with Abe Lincoln on the front and children playing baseball. I mean, this is about as American as you get, I would argue, in terms of like complex symbols and sort of the moment scenes. But maybe we can take it one step further, and that is to look at this medal. Now, your screen may be covering the sort of talking heads here, may be covering one of the most important scenes here on the medal, and that is on the reverse of the medal. Now, this was apparently a medal that once belonged to a Ute chief in the American Southwest, Utah, Colorado area, who was apparently in a violent gun battle at one point and was shot. But apparently this gouge mark here in the upper right of the medal represents where a bullet struck the medal, thus saving the man's life. But what shocked historians that learned about this in the 1920s was that the Ute chief said that the medal had not worked and that the medal had not prevented bullets from staying away from him entirely. So he was happy to get rid of the medal, and it therefore ended up in New York City in the collection of the American Numismatic Society. All right, so it's important and really interesting to ponder, and an important part of this book project will not just be marching through sort of the story of each iteration of these peace medals, but to think about how they have become an important and remain an important component in Native American life and in representations of Native Americans in many different forms. Now, again, one of the ways in which people talk and think about peace medals in sort of the numismatic community or sometimes in the museum community, we'll talk about authentic, and that authentic medals are these silver medals that were given by the US government to Native Americans, and that the market was eventually flooded with bronze restrikes and fakes and frauds and replicas. So here, arguably, I think we have a man who has a bronze medal. Now, are we going to say to this individual that that is not a quote unquote authentic medal? And there are other examples in, say, the Smithsonian of medals that are bronze, quote, restrikes or reproductions that have then been created into very sophisticated necklaces and worn and valued for many years. It strikes me as an odd sort of way to differentiate those things as authentic and not authentic in that way. I think if someone thought it was authentic, then it was authentic, and that's an important and meaningful designation. But I want to get across in the slide that here we have daguerreotypes of, you know, early photographs, early photographic images of people. We see the navigation here between the sort of change that's brought about by this unrelenting colonialism and the advancement of American and European cultures, and the ways in which people adapt to those cultures. And that included the sort of stable marker of power and status within one's tribal community. So in this case, it could be peace medals. And you can see paintings made by Native American men in the 1970s that depict this representation to Congress of this tradition in a modernist sort of way. So I want to give you this sort of sweeping notion that this has been important to Native American people for a long time. And again, I want to make clear that this isn't necessarily understood by Native Americans the way collectors or the way the original givers of these medals thought of them. And that's a really important distinction and differentiation. And I'd like for more of the Native American view to be present in this story. So we have this remarkable photograph, again, from Colorado, of a man wearing what might be called a fur trade medal or a replica medal that's given later on, maybe even by a private corporation that understood, oh, these medals that we give can help us create access, commercial access, can smooth over tense relations, and can be sort of this initial icebreaker of a gift. So while the market in some respects becomes flooded with this, you can see that people valued this still a great deal and incorporated it into the way that they dressed. This is a man named Buckskin Charlie, again photographed here in Colorado, this time on in a studio. But what I find so remarkable about this particular image is the way the Christian cross is incorporated with the peace medal, a late peace medal, as well as other traditional regalia. So there are hundreds and hundreds of photographs like this. This is a Western delegation of people going to Washington, D.C., and many historians speculate, including the premier historian on the subject, think that, and there are some historical records that indicate that this was the case, that it may be you'd be brought to Washington, D.C., spend 2 or 3 days. And this is, I'm not being facetious here, I'm going to be quite literal. They might load you up with alcohol for 2 or 3 days, have you party in the city of Washington, D.C., hang out away from your community, and then introduce a treaty to sign. And then, maybe after a couple more days in Washington, D.C., bring you back to a ceremony and offer you peace medals. And maybe you would be photographed. But it would be a busy time, it would be a confusing time, and sometimes it would be a time where the Euro-Americans or the American diplomats would stack the deck against you. But nevertheless, this could be a proud moment for you as a person, as representing your community, as doing the best with this sort of fraught outcome. And you might be wearing things that were symbols of who you were at home. And now added to this might be 1, or as you can see here, in some cases, 2 peace medals. This is a photograph that's repeated with many different tribes over the course of the late 19th century. All right, so what is the memory of these things? Like, how do we forget and remember these things? And that's, one of the things that I've become fascinated by is this idea that they're everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So I have to admit, I'm not a huge consumer of Western films. It's not necessarily my main area of even just viewing interest when I watch movies. But in looking around, like where do these things appear? Like all over the place. One of the things that I found is that they're quite prominently appear in some Westerns. So I know that by this time, the U.S. Mint was already producing and selling many restrikes, as they had by this point for a long time. So you could go to Washington, D.C., you could buy a copy of one of these. So again, if you haven't heard of this before tonight in your life, that's not shocking at all. But these are things that were around quite commonly in some sense. Now, Winchester 73, again, I haven't seen it. Jimmy Stewart as an actor, I don't know, take it or leave it. Maybe they have to take away my American history licensure if I say that. But this movie seems as much like a vehicle to sell Winchester pump action guns to deer hunters in post World War II America as it does any sort of historical reconstruction. But it is nevertheless to me very interesting that appears there. So this subject, in many respects, I argue to you, was pretty forgotten about. There were books written about it in the 1920s. People were buying and selling these books. But it wasn't until a historian named Francis Puka took on the subject in the late 1960s and early 1970s, just as there was a huge amount of interest growing in Native American history and culture. Many more Native voices themselves were becoming more active in this story. And Puka respected many of those voices, even though he disagreed with some of the ways in which they were arguing about history. But this book became an important sort of addition to the story here. But what do Native Americans think about these things, about this story? Well, one way to begin thinking about this is this, to me, really evocative and powerful quote from Jeff Van Pelt, who's quoted as saying about peace medals, about his ancestors receiving peace medals. They were told that these medals came from a great man and that they were convinced that these things had great meaning, but they were nothing less than tokens of lies. So that's a pretty severe indictment of what these things were and what the legacy was in light of everything that's happened since then. Now, as I mentioned, some peace medals were gifted to subsequent generations, and others would be buried with their recipients. So objects that are buried with you for many, and I would venture most indigenous societies in North America, things become understandably pretty sacred when you are buried with them. Certainly, if someone came across the burial of my grandfather or grandmother and they found jewelry on them, that's not something that I would necessarily want messed with in any sort of way, scientific or historic or otherwise, right? So for many Native Americans, they feel a strong connection to these objects that have been found, especially objects in grave sites, but objects of significant cultural value across sort of many people. So think like the Liberty Bell, right? Like nobody really owns the Liberty Bell, right? Like we all kind of own the Liberty Bell. And so in a sense, peace medals have become a similar sort of symbolic thing, whether or not they've been discovered in a grave site exactly or not for Native Americans. But these are complex, complicated things. Sometimes they're just sort of found in people's fields. Sometimes an original peace medal was never given to a Native American at all. So they are the perfect object for, I don't know if you guys ever watch Antiques Roadshow. It turns out I secretly love Antiques Roadshow because it's the greatest form of reality television. People bring in these things that they kind of sort of know about, and sometimes it turns out that they're worth a lot of money. And peace medals are the perfect thing for Antiques Roadshow because they connect to things that you may know about, right? Like Thomas Jefferson and the Lewis and Clark expedition and Native Americans. But you may have never heard of a peace medal that is sitting in your drawer or that someone gave to you, and that thing may be worth $300,000, as some Jefferson medals have been sold for. Others are sold, into the six figures and for far less than that. Collectors, of course, care about what condition the medal is in and the degree to which a provenance or sort of a story of the medal can be demonstrated and proven. But as you can see, I've been thinking about the story for some time. So anytime I see a medal on display, like here at the Brooklyn Museum, here's a Jefferson medal that, probably hundreds of people walk by a day. I was quite interested in how that was on exhibit. And it's not just the Brooklyn Museum, it's many, many different museums. And I want to show you this vast list, not so that you necessarily read every one, but that you get a sense, right? Like the historical societies of New York, Massachusetts, Colorado, Indiana, Idaho, Iowa, Minnesota, Missouri. there are many, many different institutions that have this in their vaults, that have these objects. And so it's important. It's not just this niche subject within our history. It's something pivotal for these institutions to think about in terms of its legacy, its ethical and moral sort of meaning, but also its historical teaching value and research value later on. And as if it's not complicated enough, here we go. Let's tie in some college football. So in, let's see, what was the date of this story? This is 2015. In a 2015 football game, University of Oregon Ducks versus the Washington State Cougars. So you may or may not know this, but Phil Knight, the CEO of Nike, went to the University of Oregon. So they sponsor new uniforms, and the University of Oregon is always doing wacky, crazy uniforms. And one of the things that they did for a uniform in 2015 was to sort of honor the pioneer legacy of Lewis and Clark. I would imagine even in 2020 that you'd get more pushback for this. But if you are a very carefully noting eye, you would notice on, I played football for a couple of years. I didn't even know that this had a name on a helmet. This is apparently called a bump on a helmet. So on the bump of the helmet here, you can see the motif of the hands shaking that was inspired by peace medals. So, you know, it's not just in Westerns, it's not just in museum exhibits. These things sort of pop up into sort of our material and visual cultural heritage in a variety of different ways, and ways in which that might surprise us, even if we're the type of people that would pay attention. So I want to leave with some big questions, right? How do we document these cross-cultural interactions? For years and years, historians sort of took for granted that the way in which we documented these things were the diaries, the written diaries of people like Lewis and Clark. But I argue to you that peace medals and in many other ways in which that we can look at the story tell us or suggest to us that there are more than one way to think about these cross-cultural interactions. People were given flags and letters or certificates that sometimes went along with these, or often went along with these documents and exchanges, and we know about them because they're written about, but is that enough? Is just sort of relying on the one written European source enough to fully understand the source? And I argue it's not. So how do we fully tell the story of these exchanges? And I think in order to do that, we have to take a look back at some of these old museum collections and talk to Native Americans today and think about the ways in which they think about these objects and how that might better inform our understanding. And again, who gets to decide? Should it be the white male curators that look like me that are able to fully decide who gets to control this story? Or should, you know, as I argue to you tonight, should it be a more collaborative way that we think about this, that we think about the future of these objects? And does it matter if these are objects that have been passed between different hands? I argue it does. I argue that their sort of object or life history is significant in this way, which is sort of a brain bender to think about, that the life history of an inanimate object has a consequential role in the way in which we think about it today. All right, so I want to leave us with that and turn over to questions, but I want to thank a couple of quick sponsors to say, I know this is a little bit of sort of a weird mashup of the University of Massachusetts and the Denver Museum of Natural History, or Nature and Science. I used to live in Denver, and I had an opportunity to work with their peace medals years ago. So that's how this relationship came together. And I'm just really honored that you guys took a moment to listen to some of the early ways in which I'm thinking about this idea. And I hope to write a book about it for you to chew on and respond to very soon.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sam. That was a wonderful presentation. And we can take 10 to 15 minutes of questions. We already have 5 or 6 questions in the chat. I can relay them to you.
Yeah, great.
Great. Yep. First up is Polly. Polly wants to know, is there a current equivalent of these medals that are used by presidents?
That's a fantastic question. So I'll say just to be direct, yes and no. There are still diplomatic gifts, and diplomatic gifts are still incredibly prominent in our diplomacy. Whether or not they have any meaning whatsoever is up to you. But you can go to basically any presidential library around the country. So go to, like, say, Reagan's presidential library in Southern California, and one of the exhibits will typically be all of the many very lovely, nice gifts that we have been given as a nation, as a to our president from around the world, and it will be fine china or gifts from indigenous material tradition. It really runs the gamut, and so this does continue in some form. But I think too the tradition becomes distilled and lessened when you get more and more fakes and frauds, and then you're also just giving sort of other diplomatic gifts away. It becomes less of a top priority for the U.S. to give these exact types of gifts. So by the 1890s, they really peter out. Great question.
Christina wants to know, did Lewis and Clark give a peace medal to Sacagawea?
That's I don't believe they did. There is an element of a very real patriarchal thinking and sexist thinking. Although what's fascinating is that I would venture a guess, if I had to just sort of throw a number out there, and this is now in my sort of tentative read, and some other historians have ask me for proof in terms of the exact numbers, but I'm going to throw out a few guesses, educated guesses. I think 95% of these medals were given originally to men, to male leaders, maybe 98%. But what's fascinating is that after a couple of generations, you can see lithographs, prints of women wearing them, and children even quite young wearing a peace medal. That have been given to them sort of as subsequent generations, or given to a wife to represent a man who was unable to travel. But by and large, they were given to men. But I think the answer to that question is no.
Linda wants to, and I can't recall exactly when Linda typed this question in, but sure. Linda wants to know, can you put this expedition into context with Indian removal?
Yeah, so great question. The two expeditions I talked about were at the early outset of that process that really begins aggressively by the 1820s. And ironically, Andrew Jackson, who's known, I think, probably without argument, as being the most aggressive implementer of those strategies, sort of delays in getting peace medals made, but it's the diplomats on the outer edges that are saying, we need more of these. We need more of these now. We need more of these yesterday. You sent 12 of them. You sent some gorgets. I need 20 of them. So it's fascinating to see people, sort of these diplomats on the outer edges, saying that as this practice is also taking place. And yeah, arguably, as Indian removal is taking place, and then subsequent to that, the sort of termination policy, when the U.S. government, that is really aggressively trying to mandate that Native people start farming and agriculture. That's really right when you see the peace medals becoming less and less significant to the U.S. diplomats. But yeah, those two things really go hand in hand. It's a story I've got to tell those two things together, because they're really sadly intertwined, but truthfully intertwined.
David has a long question. I'm going to read it here. Have you ever seen a medal transformed from its original form and incorporated into a different object, such as melted down or cut up, or even intact, but used in a completely different context? I'm thinking about the one with the purported bullet ding Well, this thing didn't work, but it's a shiny and could be used for X. Also, any that are in the context of a medicine bag, sorry for the long thoughts.
But really great question. So I'll just say, as far as transform, that's a really interesting and important thing that I'm talking about and debating, and I mean that in a good, healthy way with historians. There are examples where, a limited number of examples where one king's name might be scratched off and another person's name might be put on, or a recipient would have someone etch their name or would etch their own name into the metal. There's another story about a recipient, potential recipient of a Spanish medal, saying that the medal wasn't large enough and not being satisfied with the medal until 4 medals were somehow melded together. So to answer that question, there are some examples where things would be transformed or changed, but not like radically into something completely entirely different. But yeah, the value of these things and then the power of these things was interpreted differently by different people. There are a couple of examples, and one that I open a chapter with, of a Cherokee man who is given a medal, and people say his behavior changed, that suddenly he became a mean and a terrible leader, and he was suspected of murdering people in his own tribe, and a thunderbolt of lightning hit his home and destroyed everything. And people in the community felt that the medal had something to do with that. Now, there are many, many other examples in the historical record where people covet medals, where people want them, where people think that they're sort of this energy or power adder. But there are notable examples in the historical record where people think it's bad energy, and that's a really important part of the story as well.
Nancy has a question, simple question. What is the D on the medals? Is there a letter D on some of these medals?
Yeah, I think there's, like, as far as AD, like, I think sort of after death. And I will say too, there's a debate with some of these early medals, especially who designed them, who created them. We know that some of the earliest medals were actually created by John Turnbull, the same painter who famously painted the signing of the Declaration of Independence that's on the back of the $2 bill. It is thought, I think these are too early, but historians have sometimes thought that John Reich, a engraver who then engraved some of our earliest money, our earliest federal money, engraved this. I'll say, as a historian, like, some people are really invested in that part of the story. I'm less interested in that. It's meaningful, where these came from, but I think it's, to me, more fascinating the many ways in which they become incorporated and change over time.
Great. So I don't see any more questions in the chat, but I want to give people one last opportunity. And if anyone wanted to ask a question via audio or video, now would be the time. Do we have any takers for any last minute questions? All right, we have a shy group tonight, although we did get 5 questions in the chat, which is great. So Sam, do you have anything you want to leave us with? Any last words?
Sure. I'll say that this has always been a really fun experience for me to join you, and that this is a project that it's one of those things that you think a little bit about and you may end up thinking more and more about. So if I've roped you into thinking about this as a complex and interesting subject, maybe in a couple of years, when we're not, in maybe even a year or two, when we're not in a global pandemic, you'll go to your local bookstore and search out this new book on peace medals, and hopefully write me a note.
Sam, we do have one last minute question that came in the
Sure.
chat, and semi-related, but you can answer it. Do you have any thoughts on the Massachusetts flag?
Sure. So, just in terms of the ways in which these symbols are used and appropriated, it's of course a complex issue, and it's an issue that it strikes the nerves of a lot of people quite strongly. And it's something that in some ways has been meaningfully incorporated right into our visual heritage in a significant way. But I think on balance, these images reinforce and reify outdated, outmoded, and I know this is a word that's used and thrown around a lot, but problematic images of what Native Americans are. And it puts them in stasis as sort of these old, fashioned, now gone sort of pieces of history. So my view is that it's a moment where we really should think about these images and the statues that we have and the mascots we use. And we should revisit that and think about who we are and who we want to be. And I don't think that that's the only way that we can think about any of these things. That I just don't buy that taking down a statue is somehow erasing our history, or even burying a piece medal is somehow erasing our history. I think we can still quite readily talk about these things and think about them in important and meaningful sorts of ways, while still trying to address, even if we can't right those past wrongs. I think that's an important moment, an important thing that we should grasp onto and think about. And I hope we all can sort of take time and think about where we stand on that and how we think about that.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Sam. And that was a very good answer, by the way. I appreciate that. So I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. Want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library for sponsoring tonight's program. Sam did an excellent job. I will be sending everyone an email tomorrow morning with a feedback survey. If you could fill that out within a week and get it back to me, it would be greatly appreciated. And once again, I hope everyone has an enjoyable rest of their night. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Have a good one, everyone.
Bye-bye.